Hello, and welcome to episode 97 of our Navigating Now series, where we come to you live every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central to be in conversation with leaders in our community. I'm Molly Sutherland. I'm your host today. I'm a designer here on the Thoughtium team, and I'm really thrilled to be with you all for this conversation. Especially today, because we have a special conversation today. Right now, we're in the middle of our perspective series. And so this is a series where we go deeper into a specific topic, where we really create the space for a different perspective and topic that drive the way we see the world, the workplace, and those within. Our July perspective series is all about creating the space for experiential design. So in our first episode last week, we heard from AJ Gailey about the power of design and what it means to be focused on designing great experiences. Two things that really stuck out to me from that conversation were about being able to take people on a journey and how experiential design can really help your audience be immersed as a true participant and not just a spectator. And the other element that I loved that she talked about was when we think about what it means to be in a design mindset, the idea is that there's no right or wrong answer. Design is an iterative process. You test until something works, and there's a lot of solutions that could work, but it's about that process and finding those. So if you didn't catch our last episode, I highly suggest watching it. But today I'm excited to dive deeper into some of those ideas that were introduced and explore some key elements to bring experiential design to life with our very own Rachel and Madison, who I'll bring on a second. And then next week, we'll be wrapping up the series. I'll be sitting down with Anthony to talk about putting this into practice and some specifics and practices to do that. So let's get started in today's conversation and dive into Experiential Design 101. I'm excited to welcome my incredible colleagues, Rachel and Madison, to the conversation.
Hi, Molly. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Yes. Welcome back to both of you to Navigating Now virtual roundtable series. So I'll first turn it over to just do a short introduction of yourselves and remind everyone who you are.
Shall I kick us off?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, hi everyone. I am Madison Wright. I've been with Thoughtium for a couple years, which feels like a very long time in Thoughtium startup years. And I've been in the learning and leadership consulting space for a long time. So what that actually means is I work with companies to build programs, experiences, workshops that help upskill their people in different areas, build, knowledge, behavior, and skills. It's really going to benefit them in their role. And what I really love about that is that we spend so much of our lives working, and when we have opportunities to develop ourselves, we can really tap into our professional purpose, how we interact with others, how we're, really leading change through our work. So that's why I love this work so much. Design is a super important part of that. So I'm looking forward to talking about how design not only connects to what we do, but connects with all the different companies and professionals that we work with as well.
Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Guile, and I'm going to start my introduction actually with my degree and educational background because it will come into play later. So I got my master's degree in industrial organizational psychology, which is just a mouthful of syllables to say I practiced learning the science behind human behavior in the workplace. So be that at the individual level, the team level, the organizational level. And that experience and that background of education has really helped me in the past 7 or 8 years in the world of consulting. Similar to Madison, I've really had a focus in talent development and selection, in leadership development, in the strategic space as well. And at the heart of a lot of those experiences is the design that we put behind it. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with the both of you.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in with both of you. And I think we're going to be saying design a lot and experiential a lot. And so let's start with grounding ourselves in like, what does that even mean? Right? So at Thoughtium, we think about that as the art and science to shaping an experience. So Madison and Rachel kind of alluded to this, that can kind of live out in a lot of different ways, but it's really about thinking through that entire experience. And in our last episode, AJ shared a lot about how story can come into that and putting our audience in a story. And that really takes me back to like being a kid, getting lost in an experience, just like going all out in that. So I'd love to start us off today, Rachel, as you think back, what is your earliest memory of experience design or being immersed in an experience?
Oh, that's easy. Disney World as a kid. Now, at the time, I had no idea that I was experiencing this, whatever the designers wanted me to, because I was just totally immersed. They have so many tips and tricks that they use, whether that's like utilizing forced perspective to make attractions feel bigger than they are. They are known for their go away green paint that kind of makes the extra buildings and materials fade into the background. You don't notice it. And even like compared to other amusement parks where you wait in line for hours and just that metal kind of hurting line that you go through, you're waiting in line for hours at Disney World, but it's still part of the story and the experience because they have decorated it so well that it just feels like it's an entryway into the ride, and it helps those times go by a lot quicker.
Yeah, I definitely remember those moments of getting lost and that like the memories being so powerful that I forget I stood in line for hours and it was really part of the experience, which I think to your point is like an incredible way of how we've experienced in this design without fully knowing it. And that's I think what's beautiful about experiential design is it's so intentional to really get participants to be immersed and present in that experience. And so we're going to dive into some ways that we do that. But before we do that, Madison, I noticed that when y'all introduced yourselves, you talked about doing design, but it's not in your title, right? So I'm on staff as a designer. It is definitely the bread and butter of what I do. But design is not just for designers to focus on. It's really important for a lot of people to focus on. And so how do you relate to design in your role? Why do you think it's both important that we're both here talking about it?
Yeah. I have found in conversations with people that design does feel like something that, oh, yeah, we have a graphic designer, we have a web designer, we have people whose job it is to design. But when we really get into any professional's day-to-days, you'll be having meetings, you'll be working with others, you'll be working on something for your clients. You are constantly finding opportunities to design. And so we are designing, even though it's not in our title. And even the most, the jobs that seem the most distant from design, accounting, for example, you're still going to be designing the meetings in which you are delivering that information. And there's an opportunity to tell a story to get people interested in what you're working on. So I feel like I sit in the middle point between, I'm not technically a designer, I'm also not an accountant trying to tell a story about numbers, but I'm telling stories about, again, knowledge, behaviors, how what we're talking about contributes to your role at your company and contributing to the broader picture. That's really what we're focusing on when we're working with people in the learning and leadership space. So design is very much baked into what we do. And you said two words, immersive and engaging. And there's so much that we do as professionals that we get into the routine of things. Things seem dry. It seems like the project management that we go through in our day-to-day motions. So anything that we can do to connect with each other in the workplace that is immersive and engaging makes it that much better and more rich for everyone. So if we're able to design in the professional space for people, it makes it better, and it really, I think puts the design in places where we might not necessarily think that it would initially belong.
Yeah. I love that of like equating design to storytelling. I think there's so much of that, and there's different ways to do that, right? Like as a graphic designer, I'm doing that very visually, but that's definitely not the only way that we're telling stories. And so that makes, a ton of sense. So we're going to dive into some of this experiential design and how we kind of bring that to life in our work. And so what we've talked about is there's kind of these 3 different key elements or skill sets that come up when designing great experiences. So our first one is around being relentless in human-centric design. So Madison, how would you describe this concept?
Yeah. So when I think about human-centric design, there's a phrase that comes to mind that I heard about many years ago now, which is you can build the world's most incredible tool. That tool will not matter unless it is picked up and used. So you can create the most intelligent, beautiful, could change the world thing. And if people aren't using it, then no one's ever going to know that it existed, and all that work that you put into it will be for nothing. And so when we're designing something, we need to think about the people who are using it and the people who are experiencing it, and how we can get people to learn about it, how we can get people to start using that tool. All of those things are as much a part of designing that tool as the tool itself. So when you're designing something, it's thinking about how it interacts with how people go about their day-to-day, how people are going to learn about it, how it might change their day-to-day. You need to think about all of those things, no matter what you're designing and what you're putting together.
Yeah. I love that constant reminder of it's not just people, it's the people who you want to use it, right? And so what does being relentless about that kind of call us to do? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, let's first think about, why don't we get into the design or the creative mindset? It's because our human nature kicks in. We get into routines. We get into something that's like, this is the way we've always done it. This is how it's done. This is how I was taught to do it. And we just have our, deeply rooted way that we do things. And getting into that, I hate to use this word because I think there's a negative connotation, but complacency. If we're complacent about what we're doing and we're not asking ourselves, how can we make this better? How can we make this process better? How can we make it better for the people that we're, building something for, creating an experience for, creating a product for? We need to constantly be asking ourselves those questions. And you can bake that into the way that you are having meetings. So, or how you're going about your day to day. So I think the relentless is looking at how you move through your day, not constantly saying, how can we turn something on its head, or how can we, completely redesign this, because that will be a lot of effort that takes a lot of time. But really getting into asking questions like, how is the person who I'm building this for, how are they going to experience this? How can we make this process better for everyone involved? Is there anything that's been coming up as an issue that we might be able to address? So just asking yourself those questions at any point of the work that you do. How can we make this a bit better? Is it a priority to make better? It's just having those, I seek improvement and I seek to be better. It's really, it's a growth mindset with what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that reminder of taking a moment to reflect or pause and ask those questions rather than just, continuing to move forward can be really powerful. And so, Rachel, to make this kind of real and tangible, I'd love to hear how you've incorporated it into your work. What's an example of living into this approach of human-centric design and focusing on that?
Here's where I'll bring that psychology degree into good use. So I'll introduce a term here called the false consensus effect. And the false consensus effect is humans' tendencies. It's a cognitive bias that we have to overestimate how much other people are like us and how much we share beliefs or opinions or similar behaviors or even similar experiences. And while I learned about that in my graduate program, in theory and abstract, it became very real to me and something that I fell into quite often when I was beginning my career. And what that looked like for me, you have to understand that I am a huge learning geek. I love this stuff. I think it's fascinating. I think it's really interesting. I'm so happy I can make a career in it. And so when I would be designing these experiences early in my career, I kind of ran with the assumption that, oh, I'm creating this with pre-work and this research that's really interesting and all these follow-up activities that I thought people would be super into as well. And sometimes, honestly, it was met with blank stares or, low completion rates or noticing people were off task and distracted. And that was humbling. And the false consensus effect that I fell into was that just because I found it interesting and worthwhile, it doesn't mean that other people will as well. And so that has helped me recenter on what it means to be relentlessly human-centered in my design. And not just any humans, but the humans who we'll be interacting with, our end users. Specifically, in my case, it's a lot of times it's learners, and understanding how and when they're showing up and interacting with what we've created for them. And so the biggest recommendation I can give in this area is just to build a deep empathy for those end users. And it's kind of hard and abstract to think about that. So 3 things that have been really helpful in my career as I've started out is 1, working on my business acumen. So really understanding these people, their roles, what success means for them, so I can incorporate that into whatever it is that we're designing for them. Something else that I really rely on is the humanity of the experiences that we put together. So add a little humor, be a little vulnerable. Like, people have a stronger emotional ties. They'll have stronger memories to things that they have emotional ties with. So, like, we shouldn't shy away from the emotions in the experiences that we have, and remember that the human centeredness is a key part of this. And then I think finally, the other lesson that I've learned that I'd recommend is for people to be willing to pivot in the moment and respond to their learners' needs. So there's oftentimes I've been in these senior strategic leadership meetings, and all of a sudden we uncover a sticky topic, and you can tell that's just where the energy and the focus of the group is. And so even though we might have a great agenda of activities that are really valuable for them, it might not be what they need in the moment. So showing that willingness to pivot and respond to their needs is something I always try to do to be grounded in that human-centered design.
Rachel, I love what you were emphasizing about we're not going to get it right the first time. And that human-centric means we need to not just do that initial empathy with everyone, but we need to have that be like really bake it into our mindset. How can we make this better? How can we build it for our audience? How can we learn from what they're telling us? So I like that iterative, lesson that you shared with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And y'all are kind of leading us right into that second element, which is create space for the design process. So almost to what you're speaking of, it's not just one element to check off. Like, design really is a process. And there's a lot of different ways, formats to do that design process. But at the heart of most of those is human-centric design, which we've been talking about, and being iterative. And so finding those ways, Rachel, as you were saying, to like come back to that empathy and come back to what you're learning, and are we actually implementing it? What have we learned to do that? And so, Madison, how do you think about the design process? When you're introducing it, what's really important to consider when we think about adding in a design process to our work?
Yeah, Thoughtium has spent a lot of time thinking about how do we think about the design, as well as how do we work with our clients to create great designs. Again, if it's a learning experience, if it's a program that senior leaders are going through, any of those different things we want. And we also want them to understand design. So it's not just us designing something well, but people see like the peek behind the curtains, and they're able to bring that into their role as well. So as Thoughtium has put together kind of our perspective on, design thinking or the design process, we really start with 2 mindsets before we get into the process itself. So as you said, there's so many ways to think about it, but there's 2 things that really need to be true. So 1, we need to see ourselves as designers. It is not Molly's a designer and I'm a consultant. It's we all have a creative capacity. We can all put our minds together and design something great. And so that's what we call creative confidence. I have the confidence that I can walk into the room, I can come up with ideas with my peers, and we can create something better than what we have right now. And I have the capacity to do that. I'm able to do that. So that's the creative confidence. I can put pen to paper. I'm not shying away from the design process. The second one, it's really about the mindset. We call it convergent and divergent thinking. So those are some, like what does that mean? I'll start first with divergent thinking because that's often, we can kind of it depends on who you are. You can get stuck in one or the other. So divergent thinking is when you all say, let's come up with as many ideas as we can. There's no right or wrong answers. It's that, you're all coming up with ideas and putting them on sticky notes and putting them in the middle of the table. It doesn't need to be that exercise every time, but it's in principle, we're coming up with ideas and I'm not shooting someone's idea down because I'm like, I really don't think that's going to work. It's just not the time to do that. On the other hand, convergent, eventually with all those divergent ideas, there's a timeline that you need to hit. You need to converge on what you're ultimately going to do, as well as people are going to lose steam coming up with all these ideas. Unfortunately, the perfect idea, the perfect design or concept probably is not on the table yet, but you do need to pick one and move forward with it. So converging is getting down to the concept, design, idea, whatever it is that you're building and moving forward with it. To make that very specific, you could get on a line for 30 minutes and you could be saying, what do we want to cover in this meeting with our clients coming up? Have the space where you come up with a ton of ideas before you whittle it down to what the agenda is. Like it can be those two simple of a steps: divergent, come up with ideas; convergent, let's figure out what we're going to do. These two things can't be done at the same time. You can't be coming up with ideas and narrowing in on ideas. It's hard to do them, but we do tend to do that where, someone says, hey, I have a new idea. And, me, if I'm very stuck in what I think we should be doing, I'm like, all right, that's not going to work. So it's really best to respect the space that those two are in. So creative confidence, you step up to the table, you say, I am a designer and I can make this work. And next, divergent and convergent thinking. I recognize that we're going to need both of those ultimately to move forward. Those two come to life in the design process, which is originally laid out by IDEO. Many people will be familiar with it. It is empathize with your end user, define what problem you're trying to solve. Your end user, your learner, your stakeholder who you're going to have a meeting with is going to have a lot of things that you can address. You have to define what it is you're working on, or else you're going to, have a whole pot of things. Then you want to ideate. So that's that divergent space. You're coming up with as many ideas as possible. You want to pick one of those ideas and then prototype it, recognizing it won't be perfect, but you do need to put that pen to paper, come up with a prototype. And then you really, you start with the user. You're going to get back to the user when it's time to test that idea. Maybe you met with the user when you were empathizing, or that leader, you went off and did some of this work on your own, but you need to bring them back in. And that's where you're really testing with them and getting feedback from them. Again, a lot of times we think about this design process if I'm coming up with a tool or software or something like that, but you can really take this process to think, am I defining the problem that I'm looking to solve in this meeting? Am I prototyping this? Am I getting a meeting together beforehand to walk through what I've put together and get feedback? Am I testing this and improving it? So the last thing I'll say about this is that while I just laid out the, empathize, define, ideate, it sounds linear. It is not linear. You're going to find yourself kind of going all over the board with it. But it's just important to recognize, hey, I'm in the define stage. We need to define the problem before we start coming up with a ton of ideas. So let's define this problem first, and then let's get into that ideation space. So each one doesn't need to come in order, but it's super helpful to recognize which one you're in and focus people on the, intent of that phase.
Yeah. I love that idea of like, one, you need to know what step you're in and you might move around. I remember early in my career, I did not name what step I was in, and I'd go down a project and think it was final. And then when testing it out, it's like, who is this even for? Like, what is the problem we're solving? And it didn't address that, right? And so being able to know those are all different elements that we need to kind of think through, I think is so important.
That's such a good point about I've been designing in a silo, and then I pick up my head, I have this finished thing, and that person that you were building it for, you talked to them 3 weeks ago, and they're like, I'm sorry, what are you doing? And it seems foreign to them. So continuing to bring them in or revisit, hey, here's what I've been working on. Can I get your reaction? It's not perfect yet, but would love to see what you think of it. So I think that, I think we've all been in the, 3 weeks into something, we pick up our heads and everyone's surprised by what we came up with.
Yeah, I that happened to me a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this is how I designed it. Someone looked at it, they're like, I'm experiencing it very different. And that's where I'm like, wow, that test phase really matters, because what we ended up with is such a better product. But I was too far into that project, right? And it was just me, and I knew all the context in my head. And so getting fresh set of eyes was so helpful in figuring out how to iterate and go back. And I think that's a really important piece to this design process, is actually like inviting people into that process, not going through it alone. Rachel, I'd love to hear from you of like, how do you invite people into that process? How, when you're designing an experience or an engagement, how's collaboration really impacted that work?
Well, the short answer is early and often. But if you want me to expand upon that a little bit more, just speaking from my experience in the consulting world, I think there is this sense of perhaps false pressure that anything we produce needs to be at a high level before we show it to anyone else. Like Madison said, we go down, we meet with people, we do our work, and come back a few weeks later. And I would challenge ourselves to maybe dive into what I call some uncommon knowledge about it's better to be public before perfect. And so what that means is that willingness to put your design or put your ideas in front of your stakeholders. And more than that, kind of get the fingerprints of your stakeholders all over it as well. If you're designing an experience, having your stakeholders involved will not only lead to a better outcome, it'll lead to better buy-in for that experience down the road, and also just a better working relationship and respect that you have with the partner that you're doing that with. So I'd say the magic of this really comes down to understanding who to invite, when, and to what extent, because it shifts over the course of the project. For me, for example, I always say it's really important to get those senior stakeholders involved early as we're setting the strategic direction of an experience or whatever it is we're designing, so that we know we're going in the right direction, and work in those details a bit more with your working team or those end users as you prototype and test.
Yeah, love that idea of like, there's also different points, right, that we can bring people in. And so thinking about that is so helpful. So before we go to our kind of last element, Madison, what kind of impact have you seen in your work from creating space for the design process? For, when we say creating space for the design process, we mean that of like, it's not just one day and you're going to make it happen, but making sure you're creating space to have those steps, invite people in. What have you seen kind of results from doing that?
Yeah. So we have a number of clients who are in the pharma industry. And the pharma industry, there's a lot of legal and compliance, and there are the ways things have been done for many, many years. And a lot of people are used to, well, this is how workshops are run, and this is how I learn about product training. And I've been in this routine for 15 years. And there was a company that we've been working with, and we really had an opportunity to get to know the aspirations of our stakeholders, the aspirations of the senior leaders, and the learners who we were ultimately making something for. And what we were hearing was that those half-day workshops where they learned every little bit, like tiny thing about the products, was really not resonating with them. There is a necessity for that type of depth of information, but unfortunately, they were also experiencing their leadership training in the same result. Like, there would be a talking head who would talk at them about how to be better leaders. And, we know that that is not the way to get people exercising their leadership capabilities and talking about their challenges. And so we know that. But we really listened to them. We also listened to how busy they were. And we ultimately designed a leadership development experience that is very much ingrained in their work, as well as doesn't just rely on workshops that you have to, sit and try to focus on Zoom while you have 3 other browsers open or are responding to customer emails or something like that. We broke it down. We made it self-paced. We made it collaborative. We put in coaching. We created something that was really going to drive behavior change and really give these people the experience that worked really well for them. So we were able to get to know them really well and challenge them to do something different than what they've been doing for a very long time. And the result was our clients saying, we have never seen something this well designed for this audience, and this is better than anything I've seen for leadership development in the many pharma companies I've worked for. And so that kind of, recognition just really demonstrated that we are trying to push you to design for your people, for their careers, for what works for them, rather than just, again, here's that complacent word, being complacent with this is the way we do things, so let's just get it done.
Yeah. And I love in that example of like, you're not having to just come up with the answer out of nowhere, right? You're not just like grasping at, we'll figure out what it is and hopefully it sticks. You're like going to the people that are going to use it and making it work for them. And just responding to that, is going to go wonders. Yeah.
Yeah, I am not some all-powerful designer locked away in a room making, a masterpiece. This took a lot of conversations and questions and testing things out, saying, how does this idea sound? And, oh, that conflicts with something else you're doing. And, well, let's figure out what you need. So, I'm not tucked away with some designer perfection. It really is a very collaborative process.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about kind of the importance of designing for the user, always, relentlessly, about how to create space for that process. And so our last kind of concept here when we think about designing great experiences is uncovering the hidden layers of design. Sounds super cool, but what does it mean? So Rachel, can you break down like what that means and what does this kind of call us to do to uncover these hidden layers of design?
Absolutely. So I'll talk about this in terms of learning and development and L&D experiences. And I think L&D as a profession has the tendency to accidentally over-rotate on the material or the content or knowledge that we're sharing out and less about the experience, which is why it's important to keep design experience at the forefront. And even here, I'll simplify experience into thinking about an experience is the intersection of people and time and space. And when I'm talking about those layers underneath, it's kind of the extent to which we use each of them. So if I'm thinking about these different layers, what I like to think of it as inclusivity, engagement, and then impact. And I think we have a visual that we can throw up to the screen here to show as well. And you can follow along as I talk about this. But our goal is ultimately to be impactful in all ways in this experience. So here, inclusivity, I would say, is table stakes. At a minimum, any experience that we design needs to be inclusive. The language that we use, the imagery that we use, if it's virtual, inclusive of a global audience, perhaps across different time zones, if it's in person, catering to people of different physical abilities. I think inclusivity is first step, the first layer of experience design that just ensures that your learners or your participants can have the opportunity to show up and be their best selves. One layer deeper is creating an experience that is actually engaging. And what I mean by here is that people are engaging not only with the material, but also with the facilitator, and really importantly, with each other. That's a huge mode of social learning that you get to foster in engaging experiences. So maybe that means utilizing Zoom to its full extent of the polling and the chatting features. Maybe in person, it's creating a physical experience of a gallery walk where it highlights different teams' experiences and gives you an opportunity to interact with them and share kudos. Or that could look like just creating the space, both physically and emotionally, to have meaningful conversations and to ask questions of each other and about each other so you can benefit from those people's experiences and those people's learnings. And then the third and the deepest layer that we always strive for here, the one that is most meaningful to me, is this idea of having an impactful experience. And again, from the lens of L&D, our programming is such a small portion of someone's role or their day-to-day job that we're always striving to create an experience that kind of has an impact beyond those metaphorical four walls that we're designing. And so what that looks like, or how you're successful in that, is you get people to think differently about a concept, or they change their mindset or their behaviors back on the job, or they come back to you months later and say, hey, I remember we discussed this XYZ concept, and that's really stuck with me. And that's how you know that you created an impactful experience, even though you had them with limited time, limited space, those people that you're curating with, that just kind of goes beyond that singular experience and into the fabric of their jobs and their lives.
Yeah. I love that framework too, to say like you really are digging deeper into layers, because you're not going to have that lasting impact if someone's not engaged with the people that they're there with, or feeling like included in the experience and that they can show up to be their best selves. So I love that idea of breaking down how we're designing in order to achieve all these different things. That framework, kind of reminds me of last week. Anthony and AJ touched on how like gaps can exist between the message we want to tell and are telling, and how people actually engage with it, or if they engage with it. And so I love how this framework helps us kind of break down to say, like, we need to make sure that people are not only active listening and being there, but also relating to the content, the purpose, really engaging and seeing themselves in it. And I think that framework really helps like create those full immersed participants rather than spectators at an experience. And so, I think to make kind of that framework, bring it to life, Rachel, is there an experience that, you've either designed or participated in that you felt like really uncovered those different layers, really helped participants be really fully engaged?
Yeah, so when I think about experiences like that, they're generally fairly dynamic. And one of the favorite things I like to work on that Thoughtium does is playing in the area of onboarding, because that's an experience that lasts for a few months. And it not only helps immerse people in a good onboarding experience, but it will truly immerse people in the organization as well. So I'm just wrapping up doing this with one of our clients. I'll speak to that as I kind of walk through the framework again. But we're really intentional in how we designed it. So with that layer of inclusivity, we are really thoughtful about how accessible and how approachable the content was, the extent of the content was for the new hires as they were coming on, by offering, self-paced learning. We were really intentional with the storyline of the flow and the structure of the learners. And when we're doing those virtual workshops, inclusive of the time zones and where people are in their careers and catering to that, the engagement we had then was phenomenal, actually. And I would attribute this to like the multimodality with which we approached how people first interacted with the material and the content. So we had podcasts, we had assessments, we had workshops, we had practice opportunities, which was all great different modalities. Then we also had different structures for people to engage with the people. And I think that's a really often overlooked aspect of onboarding. You're not being only onboarded to like the knowledge of the organization, but also to the culture and to the people. So we are really intentional in structuring time for there to be a mentorship program, shadowing opportunities, one-on-one conversations with senior leaders, a cohort we designed around panelists of subject matter experts on certain topics. And I think that really helped people engage in the material and, again, immerse themselves not only in the experience of onboarding, but immerse themselves into the organization. And the impact that we've seen so far is just incredible. I mean, not only is there high NPS scores for the onboarding program, but for the organization overall, and it's helping drive just better retention, better productivity, satisfaction with people are, and like their ability to do their job. So at a holistic level, it's been very impactful, and I think we did that by consciously looking at those different layers at the individual level, and making sure we're creating an experience that they could immerse themselves in and would have impact beyond just the times and the touch points that we had with them.
Yeah, I will share, as someone who went through the Thoughtium onboarding process 3 months or so ago, the ability to have that really intentional, like immersive process was totally different for me. And I think I am now more connected to the people I'm working with, to the work that we're doing, whether it directly relates to my role or not, because of the intention of that onboarding process. And I think, the piece that you highlighted that really resonated for me is that you're onboarding not just to a company, but also the team and the people that you're working with. And that ability to get to know people, I think, is so valuable within that as well. I think we could probably dive in for a lot longer on onboarding processes, but before we kind of wrap up today's conversation, I think it's been so helpful to hear from you both on all these different ways that we can start incorporating and thinking about design mindset. And when we're designing experiences, the different elements to add into that. So next week we'll be diving into some specific tools and practices. But before then, Madison, if you could close us up with what are one or two things that you would want people to keep in mind or kind of walk away with when approaching designing great experiences?
Yeah, I'm happy to round out our conversation. And Molly, let me know if you think I miss anything. I would say one is everyone is a designer. Not just the designers, not just Rachel and I working on learning experiences. We are all designing something. It might just be our personal interactions, might be the meetings that we're leading. There's so many human-centric, conversations and events that we really are ultimately designing for. And then within that, design is it's not a complex, process only a few people know how to navigate through. It's really, you step into the mindset of how can I have a design mindset, a growth mindset? How can we make things better? And you're not creating something super complex. Oftentimes you're creating something that's more simple or more meaningful for the people that you're delivering it to. And that's really what we're trying to get to is, it gets down to that impact, simple and meaningful impact, and how we're acting with the people around us.
Yeah, I love that summary of sharing. It is approachable. And we're all doing it. So I love that. And kind of bringing it back to those telling stories and inviting people in. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you, Rachel and Madison, for joining me today. It has been a blast chatting with you on all things experience design.
Thank you, Molly.
So, yes. So to wrap up, to learn more about these concepts, you can visit Thoughtium.com/perspectives. And you'll find links to the conversations, read an article walking through those 3 concepts from today, download a toolkit, and more. And definitely invite you to join us next week, where I'll be sitting down with Anthony to wrap up our series talking about the tools, practices to bring great design and experiential design to life, and to bring a design mindset to your role in organizations. So thank you again, Rachel and Madison, and we will see you next time.